Hi everyone, Francesca Amato with Punish for Protecting. We have a very special treat today. We're Michael Stone here, and Dr. Stone has credentials that we can't even cover all the walls with them, but we're looking.
And yes, the top psychiatrist, but I'm also in Who's Who this past year with my full page on me as a psychiatrist in the Marquis Who's Who in America. I have authors of 13 books.
Why don't we take it over here so we can take a look a little bit. They have 13 books here.
Starting borderline syndromes, borderline personality disorder, and one on schizophrenia, one on the history of psychiatry. This one is on abnormalities of personality in general. And then I got interested in the topic of serious crimes, and so that there's a book here on evil. And let us see. Oh, one called The Anatomy of Evil, which was like I did 10 years ago. And that led to my being picked up by where they sent me around the country interviewing prison serial rapists, murderers, men who killed their wives who killed their husbands.
Wow.
And so I would go around the country interviewing these people, and then in the year and a half ago, began to work on a sequel to The Anatomy of Evil with a colleague of mine from Columbia, a psychologist, Dr. Brucato. And Dr. Brucato and I then authored the book, The New Evil, which was like follow-up about the previous book, and also giving new, different kinds of heinous cases that I did not get a chance to write about in the first book.
Oh.
And now we're even working on the sequel to that book with some of the crimes in the last 10 years or so that are things that almost never occurred before, in our country.
So 13 books you've authored and co-authored as well.
Yes. And then these are some of the, I don't have all of the 265 chapters and articles, but these are some of the more recent ones in these books.
That's terrific. And the reason that I wanted to interview you today, and it's such an honor to be able to do this for the viewing audience that I mostly have, are a lot of times of the family court,
yes,
in which we've talked about, and child victims and parental victims. We can maybe sit down and we can go over some of the questions that I have. Thank you.
I said, you've done enough acting.
Enough acting for one lifetime. Oh my goodness.
So picking up on his Brooklyn accent. So, but anyway, so during that time, of course, in the hospital, there would be a court meeting every Wednesday, so that I was very, very often testifying on behalf of the hospital as to whether a particular patient still needed to be in the hospital. In other words, the patient would say, well, I've been here 4 years. He would hire a lawyer and say, I'm ready to leave. But oftentimes we considered he was still dangerous, and therefore he wasn't ready to leave.
Right.
And therefore there would be a lawyer testifying on his behalf, and then I would testify on the behalf of the hospital. And mind you, there were about 14 psychiatrists, of which I was one, who worked at the hospital, and each of us would take turns, going to the court on behalf of the hospital, thinking that so-and-so was really still dangerous and not ready to leave. So therefore, I was facing the judge and the court almost every Wednesday, for several years. And then in addition, if I worked on another civil case or even a dangerous case, and that was not involved with the forensic hospital, I would be testifying, either sending a report to the court or showing up in court, like a court in Westchester or a court downtown, or sometimes federal court downtown, testifying on behalf of either the state or the federal government.
So what about with regards to family court? How many years would you say you've been involved with testifying or involved in that?
Probably 20.
20 years.
Yeah.
So, and basically, majority of them would have been like Manhattan Family Court and others though, right? Like even, I know you travel.
Manhattan, Westchester. Occasionally, I would travel outside the state, or I would give reports. Sometimes the person would fly from California to meet with me here, or else I would go to California or to Texas or to Georgia or someplace, and interview someone who was involved in a custody. For example, there was a custody case in Northern California where the mother had 2 children who were, one of whom was Shirley, the girl, violated by the father. The father came from a very, very wealthy background. He himself did not work. He just lived off the trust fund from his father. The mother was a very fine woman, but she came from a more modest background.
So we were talking about family court, and then
Yes.
you've been doing that for over 20 years, and you were telling about the story about the mother and the father that was wealthy with the trust fund.
Yes. I'm trying to think of a different case. One of the early cases, because we spoke about the wealthy banker, but this is a different.
Yeah, the California.
Which was? I'm going back to the early cases. Let's see.
Yeah, about 20 years.
Well,
It'll come.
But
But you've done obviously over 20 years worth of just traveling and
the California case.
The California case, that's right.
In Northern California, this man who lived off a trust fund from his extremely wealthy father abused the daughter sexually, and this was certified by a pediatric gynecologist that the mother brought the girl to, who was bleeding from the vagina. Okay? Nevertheless, she did not get custody of the child because of the comment I made before about money talks and bullshit walks. The father managed to retain custody because the mother didn't have the means, even though we reported on the television, we sent reports. We did not, in that case, we did not prevail. It was most unfortunate.
And that was a California judge at the time?
That was a Northern California case. Yes.
And this was about 20 years ago, so this has been going on for a number of years.
Yes.
Do you see this happening a lot? Do you see this happening frequently, where an abuser is getting children, even with evidence presented to these judges? You've been seeing this.
I've been seeing that. Yes.
Yeah, all your years. And so, what are some of the things? I know I was very happy, without saying the name of a client, to see what you had wrote to one of the courts, telling them that you do not believe that your client should have to follow a custody order that endangers, in this particular case, the child. Yeah. Is this something that you defend often, is to protect children from abusers and so on? Yeah. What is I have so many questions, and I know my audience has so many questions, because I deal with the victims all over the country personally. And I've seen this also for years, not as many as you, but I know it spans decades. And I've been in and out of courts watching CPS falsify records, just blatantly lie. I've seen, you had a funny term for what you call them,
Whores of the court.
Whores of the court. He calls them whores of the court. Child attorneys, the judges. What is some of the things that you've seen? What as a
Well,
as an expert?
I've seen, well, there's a case in one of the southern states, for example, where there was um, um, three children, aged about 9, 10, about 9, 11, and 13, um, uh, with a very nice father who was working in the business world and earning good money. But the mother was severely alcoholic and, uh, and nevertheless came from a very, very wealthy family. So again, she was able to mount a more persuasive defense to the rather corrupt judge down there. Maybe it's not fair to say the corrupt, maybe just not highly schooled in what goes on, and therefore at the mercy of the people that he tends to hire, psychologists, to make appraisals. But the appraisals are often staggered in favor of who's got the money.
Excellent.
So, for example, in this particular case, the father, who was a very lovely man, and it was for a while I was called upon to treat, even though he didn't need treatment. He had at one point caught his wife, who was dead drunk and on the floor, and then on another occasion she drove with the three children in the back of her car while drunk, but a breathalyzer was installed in the car. So in order to get the car going, she had her daughter breathe into the breathalyzer, which is a crime in all 50 states.
That's right.
And she ran into a mailbox, luckily not into a tree, so the children survived, etc. But when it came to the court, when I, of course, said that the father is the worthy parent, and the children were so much against the mother, they disliked the mother, and they were very fond of the father, but the court awarded the custody to the mother, and so we had to relinquish, this is a year ago, we had to relinquish custody to the alcoholic mother. It was a terrible case, but the psychologists who were hired by the court to examine the father portrayed him as a narcissist and all kinds of personality, disorder, none of which was true. And then they also had him do a Rorschach test, a psychological test with the ink blots, and then use that to make all sorts of bad diagnoses, as though we were half schizophrenic and so on, none of which was and was true. And beyond that, they didn't provide in the report to me any of the actual data. So there was just I'm a psychologist so-and-so, and this is my diagnosis.
Wow.
But no, so what I did was I had him re-examined by a psychiatrist, very worthy one in the city. He had to come up all the way from the south, to be interviewed by a creditable psychiatrist with the same exams as was done by this corrupt person. And of course, he came through with totally clean and with flying colors as a person with none of those diagnoses. So that was a more scientific demonstration of corruptness. In other words, it's not just, this is what I think, that's what you think. No, here it was, you could put side by side two psychiatric exams, two ink blot exams, one with no data, calling him all sorts of negative things, one with tons of data saying that this man is normal and has no personality or other psychiatric diagnoses. So that was about as clear a proof.
And yet the judge, which way did the judge
went ahead and didn't listen and gave the custody to the mother. And the report by the corrupt psychologist accused him of parental alienation and therefore ordered reunification, which is another illegitimate situation where there's these reunification camps in California where the children are sequestered, almost like being a wilderness group, but costing tons of money and many months, as if the theory being, I suppose, that a child with two parents, each parent is equally worthy, and therefore, if one child or children have been under the care of parent A who doesn't really like, often for very valid reasons, or doesn't trust the worthiness as a parent of the ex-spouse, even though in that case the reunification is illegitimate and silly. In other words, because it's not always the case that the two parents are of equal value and worthiness, and therefore, in other words, if every case where there's two parents, there's always two parents. But one's as good as the other, and one is mean and trying to say bad things. Well, then the idea of reunification, trying to get the other parent to have proper time, it would make some sense. But that's not the kind of cases that go
No, not
to
at all.
reunification. No, it's where there's really a worthy parent and a terrible parent, an abusive parent, who's considered the equal of the other parent, and therefore worthy of being, quotes, reunified. So I see that kind of corruptness in the recent years. I didn't even hear the term reunification. Parental alienation frequently, but reunification, that's something rather new, at least in my experience, over the past maybe 3-4 years.
I've seen so much corruption that it's off the charts, and it blows my mind that it's still open in the first place, doing this damage to families. Here's a good question. Children who, children who tend to favor their abuser, though, sometimes, or will defend their abuser. What would that? How would you explain that? Because I do see that often as well, where they're actually mean to the nice parent, or they're overprotective of the abuser.
I've seen that only. I haven't seen that very often.
Okay.
But I think there's such a thing as, especially if the parent happens to have spent more time. In other words, if it's a mother who is often angry and abusive, but the father has been separated or divorced, or is a nice person but hasn't been very much with the children, and the children are more used to the more difficult and less worthy parent. Simply the identification with the less worthy parent can lead the child to stick up for the parent who is abusive, because it's in effect all they know, and they feel that there's an attachment, even though the attachment is to the unpleasant parent, but attachment counts for something. Especially a small child is oftentimes hasn't yet matured enough to be able to grasp that. Well, I've been more with mommy than with dad over the past, but mommy's mean, so maybe I would be better off. No, but they'll tend to stick with the one that they're become attached to and more familiar with,
and that maybe don't even understand the abuse,
because they don't grasp it, or they're scared, to, or they may even be intimidated and scared, they may feel they'd rather be with the other parent, but they would be frightened of what if they were to say, especially in court, I'd rather be with daddy, so they're going to then be spanked or acted, the mother will maybe act in a very negative way and hurt the child in some fashion. So
what about some of these child attorneys? I see where, and I've court watched numerous courts, I've been involved personally too, where a child attorney will defend the abuser and not defend the protective parent that's actually doing all the provisions needed for the child. What have you seen that as well? Or
in this southern case that I mentioned, where the mother was alcoholic, and of course the psychologist hired by the court, of course, interviewed both the father and the mother. So
And went straight for the bad one.
and went straight for the moneyed bad one.
Right, the moneyed in that case. But
Rather-
they all make money no matter rich or poor, though. There's
Yeah.
so much money coming through this system. Oh my God.
So that
But they're getting more from somebody wealthy, there's no question.
Yeah.
So yeah, then you've seen them go towards that. What about children who have suffered trauma from the family court system, whereby they may have been taken from their loving caretaker, and given to the abuser, or whoever, maybe thrown into foster care where they're really being abused?
Yeah.
What happens to these children if they're going normal, growing at a normal rate, educationally and mentally? What happens after trauma like that sets in?
Well, if they're put in fosterage, then it's pot luck
Yeah.
whether you get a foster parent who's worthy and caring, etc., or whether you get somebody who's either neglectful or abusive, but in for the money. So there's another family that I have dealt with where very tragic, where they had 3 children through adoption. The father had, through a previous marriage, a daughter of his own, but that was years ago. So here they have 3 children who, at the time they first became involved in the court, were, I think, ages 4, 6, and 8. The 4-year-old was a child with some brain damage, and the other 2 were more normal. And he also was a chronic liar.
The child, the 4-year-old.
The 4-year-old. The towel in the toilet. So when it flushed, of course, it overloaded and the water was all over the floor. And the teacher, when she confronted him, he said, well, mommy had me stand on a chair, and then she kicked the chair out from under me during breakfast, before he came to the pre-K. It was a total lie.
Wow, she could be in so much trouble.
So at that point, the teacher felt she must call CPS, so they sent over the
worst thing you could do, but
a CPS worker. Just not a very schooled or careful person. I can't say she was a wicked person. She was
right. They like to hire people who aren't very schooled.
So, so she believed that 4-year-old, didn't even interview the parents.
Wow.
And sent the parents to jail.
Oh my gosh.
And the children to a hospital. All three.
Oh my gosh.
So the parents
trauma all over the place.
Only in jail for a short time, a couple days. But the children were sent away to fosterage.
Ruined life.
And the foster parents, the first set, were in the Bronx, New York. A poor family, basically, but they were in the foster business, because you get $60,000 tax-free per year and then with 3 kids, that's $180,000. And they were also doing 2 other families, so they had 9 children in this apartment in Bronx.
Unbelievable.
And who they were, if not maltreating, at least neglecting.
Of course.
And obviously didn't.
And this passed. Think about that. This passed.
And then the horrors of the court in this particular case
horrors of the court
neglecting my report, saying
of course it's
that these were very worthy parents, and that the child was lying, and the mother never did anything
like that
mean, let alone kick
what a shame. Oh my God.
The chair from under the child at breakfast. And that was 6 years ago, and they've hardly ever been able, the parents, to even have visitation.
Oh my God.
And because the judges are always, well, what if there was even a 1% chance?
But they don't care about real abuse. I can assure you, when it's existent, they don't care.
But the judges say that they're.
But this is a way for them to make money, right?
Mantra is, well, okay, maybe she didn't kick, but what if she did?
That chance that they did.
Or what if she did something like that? To be on the safe side.
Right.
But
they only use the safe side when they want to, because when there's real abuse, those children are being repeatedly abused or abused in the system or abused by one of the parents, so they don't care about the safe side. I know, I've lived it, and I live it every day with the families, including my own.
So this is an extremely corrupt and tragic case.
Yeah.
I've been,
This poor family, though.
I follow. I talk to them often because at first I was ordered to treat them, even though they didn't need any treatment because they were very good parents.
Right.
If I had to go through the motions of pretending to treat,
Right.
and write reports, which were then nevertheless, no matter how
ignored anyway.
Yeah, they were totally ignored. I said these are very worthy
and
parents.
here you are, an expert upon experts, and they're going to ignore you anyway.
Right.
So why put you on that?
Yeah.
They're making money all under the table.
Yes. Yeah.
It's disgusting. But now, have you had any access to these children to see how they've declined, or do you know anything about how these children themselves that have been taken away?
The children are like 10, 12, and 14.
Yeah.
The girl was always okay, and the middle, but the younger one was very troublesome in school. Mm-hmm. So he was often called on the carpet for unruly behavior in the school. Mm-hmm. So he's been a troublesome child all the way from the day he was born.
Yeah, just that kind of personality.
So he hasn't. So he's been a little bit less disruptive, I think, now that he's like 10 or whatever, than he was when he was 4. But hardly, and then of course hardly remembers the real parents, so that he tends to call the foster woman, and by the way, not the bad foster, but finally the state picked up the fact that these the first set of foster parents were not good, and so they gave the 3 of them to another foster mother who had no husband, but she had a daughter by some previous union, and the daughter was 15 and 16 or whatever. So when the mother would work, she would leave the children in the care of the 15-year-old. But the mother was not a bad person. However, she lived in a different part of the Bronx, which was so dangerous that the children could never walk in the street.
Yeah, so they had no life after.
So they had no life.
But I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, when children suffer trauma from being ripped from their bio family like this, especially loving family, what happens to them educationally, psychologically?
Well, mind you, the boy, the young one, who was the troublemaker, calls the new foster mother mom, because he doesn't know his own mother, and they're not 18 and released into society yet, right? So it's hard to say, but I suspect that even though the child is maybe not quite as disruptive and wicked as he had been at age 4,
when he was
is not going to have a good life.
Terrible fours.
His IQ was way lower than the other 2, like in the 80s, as opposed to the normal IQ, or even higher than normal IQ of the other 2. Yeah. So that he's not destined for a good life.
Right, automatic. But the other 2, you really are able to find out how their life is going, or.
They're just in school doing okay.
They're just doing okay.
With occasional brief visits under supervision, which cost the parents.
Such a shame.
The parents have spent several $100,000.
I can't even imagine. Yeah. It takes 10 seconds to spend to try to save your children, and it's a multi-trillion-dollar business. It's disgusting. That's right. But now, children that, aside from children who have been molested and sexually abused, because I see that every day, where these child care centers and so on and so forth, whatever name they want to give them, when these children are sexually abused, they ignore that. They ignore medical forensics that they've been sexually abused. They're stopping mothers, we know one in particular, from mothers or fathers, but from taking them to doctors if they're being sexually abused, so they can't prove the sexual abuse. This is the kind of stuff that's going on. But aside from the sexually abused cases, just the cases where children have been traumatized from being removed from a loving caretaker biological family. So they lose their whole family. Yeah. They don't just lose mom or dad. They lose the whole bio, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, neighbors, even neighbors in the neighborhood when this happens. How can that be healthy for society on a whole when this is happening, when these judges are making these decisions? Can that be healthy for our country on a whole? Because we're talking about not 5 kids or 10 kids, we're talking about countless children throughout the nation. What is your opinion on that?
Well,
it's a loaded.
Those children are obviously in a bad way, and they're going to be traumatized in both through the loss of at least one, if not 2, caring parents, plus all the relatives you mentioned and friends and neighborhood, but also to propel it into a new kind of life, which is often one characterized by neglect, sometimes even the abuse on the part of the foster parents, or in other words, they were taken away from the parents as though the parents were abusive,
right,
who weren't,
and then placed into
and then
abuse.
put into a situation of foster parents who are either neglectful or somewhat abusive themselves. So that it's a very rocky road, clearly for the children who scarcely have even much opportunity to be even visiting the original parent, let alone being put back in the original home and milieu that they're used to. Oftentimes they go from a middle or upper class milieu into a much lower, where there's less money, less toys, less education opportunities, less people that give a damn about their education and going to higher education and things of that sort, because that's not in the interest of the.
Well, and would they regress educationally? Like, say they were in third grade, and then this abrupt change happens in their life. Now they can't get near their parents, so I can't even imagine the trauma. It's sick. But would they start to regress and maybe go back a grade level or two, or be stunted that
I
way?
can picture it. I don't know precisely. I don't know whether these children, like these three I mentioned,
for example,
have had to go to like lose a year basically, or go back.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Right.
So you might know more than I do about that. The main disruption, of course, is being torn from one familiar environment that was really not so bad, and thrust into another environment, which is much less comforting and so on than the original one, and that's what they're now stuck with, which I'm sure fosters a great deal of pain, depression, and cynicism.
Right.
On top of, it's one thing to be just depressed, you've lost mommy and daddy, but also when the children begin to realize that they're just like pawns in a court, chessboard.
Kids hate that.
Then they become very cynical because they are very distrusting of the so-called higher authorities who have really damaged them.
Now, Anthony has a question, but before he asks it, I don't want to lose my train of thought.
No.
I don't want to forget that I want to ask you, because your books fascinate me, because I've been watching a Netflix series called I Am a Killer, I think it's called, and the majority of the adults, it's heartbreaking, because I don't think they would have gone that route. Most of them came from foster families, and they were thrown into foster homes, and they became like this. I don't know if that's part of what you're talking about in your books, but have you seen that, where children become, as they become adults, because of the disruption, where they are maybe not killing somebody,
yes,
but they are doing things rebellious, and they're doing things.
Yes. For example, but by the way, since I have this patient waiting, do you have some idea how long?
Maybe 8 more minutes.
Okay.
And then this question.
The Leonard Lake, who was a serial killer out in California, was taken away from his. I think his mother gave him up when he was 2. She made another alliance. Didn't want to be bothered, with the children, so that he really had no real mothering.
No, sad.
He was then adopted into a family that didn't much care about him, etc. And then as he got older, he became a Marine actually, and he teamed up with a fellow from Hong Kong, Chitat Ing by name, who came to this country, and the two of them then began to do extremely wicked things. They had a like a house in a farm or some isolated area near San Francisco, and they would capture women, sometimes a whole family, and then Leonard Lake, for example, would kill the child, like a 2-year-old or a baby, tie the mother to a chair and say the mother, of course, would be crying,
Yeah, oh
when
my
can I see my
gosh.
child? And it says,
Oh.
well, I said, that's up to us. And it said, we don't know whether you deserve to see that child. I said, but you have choices. You can either, you can either stay here and you can cook for us, and you can fuck for us, and
Oh
you
my
can
goodness.
clean for us, or you can refuse to do that, in which case we'll kill you. It's your choice.
Wow. I'd rather die if watch my kid get killed in front of me.
That's Leonard Lake. Okay?
Yeah.
Now, eventually, he was caught by the police, and he was committed suicide. Chitat Eng had escaped meantime to Canada. It took the California court several $1 million and a couple of years before they could get, because Canada is so much against the death penalty that they,
Right.
since it's a death penalty case,
Right.
because they killed so many people, that they refused to extradite him back to California until finally the court was able to do that, and he ended up in San Quentin, and I was able to follow his fate because I was working with the head psychologist at San Quentin, who knew all of these horrible people.
Wow.
And bring me up to date about the terrible things that the different inmates were doing, including this fellow from Hong Kong who used to throw feces at the psychologist or make trouble, in the prison. But there was a case, where the original main person, Leonard Lake, had been abandoned and totally neglected, by his own mother, and then that affected him seriously as far as having total contempt, for women, even though he had girlfriends and along the way, but no ability to really connect,
and have a real
with
relationship,
anyone, so.
Wow. I know Anthony has some
Okay,
questions.
so 2 quick questions. Very brief. Could you please speak about the effect on the brain, in particular, the neurotoxicity of glucocorticoids in the brain, the stress hormone, with all this trauma?
Well, the
filicide effect.
There have been some of these damaged individuals who have been studied with MRI and other mechanisms to study what's going on, and many of them have damages in the limbic system and the frontal lobe, but particularly in starting out with the amygdala in the limbic system that subserves our reaction to emotionally stressful situations, so that they have a abnormal reactivity, so that things that would ordinarily, let's say, be considered inadmissible if you're planning to do something, it doesn't register in the same way as it does in a normal person because of the damage that's been done to the glucocorticoid and other systems in the brain, so that if, for example, they feel like doing something wicked, the impulse generating in the amygdala will be sent it to the nucleus accumbens, and where it'll say, well, it's probably okay, and then that gets sent to the singular gyrus, just lying over the corpus callosum in the brain, where it acts as a kind of judge and jury, so that it says, well, you could do it, but you might get in trouble, so I would kind of suggest against it. But then maybe it says, but that person's singular gyrus must say, yeah, well, it's probably not the best thing, but what the heck, I would say, yeah, go ahead and do it. And then it gets sent to the frontal lobes and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which has more immediate decision making, and it says, yeah, go for it. And then the person doesn't. Whereas if they did not have a brain, that was now affected by their previous terrible things that happened to them, they would, or if they were not born with a predisposition to be a psychopath, which can be inherited,
Wow.
the abnormalities in the brain, they'll go ahead and do it, such as Justin Barber, the fellow who was down in Florida, who was married to a woman that was more successful, making more money than he, and on one of their wedding anniversaries, like after 3-4 years, he said, "Oh, well, let's have like a nighttime dinner, out on by the beach in California and in Florida."
Mm-hmm.
So the two of them are out there having a picnic in the evening. At which point he kills her.
Oh my God.
Then he shoots her in the head, and he shoots himself in body parts that would not be fatal. So he stumbles out into the street, and policemen are there, and he says, "This Mexican guy came in and he killed my wife, and he shot me." Now the police are not as stupid as people think. It says, "The Mexican guy shot your wife dead with one shot, and he shot you 4 times, and you're still living? I don't know."
Wow. Good thinking.
So he was ultimately convicted and put in prison. But these areas of the brain, were operating in not at all the right fashion. So
Yeah, I'd say.
So that something that you and I would decide was unthinkable, his brain said, "Yeah, I think you can do it and get away with it."
Wow. Wow.
Right. And I think you answered part of the question, but would you suggest it's fair to say that a lot of these vexatious litigation in these courts are leading to spikes in suicide and filicide in America?
Suicide, yes. Filicide, probably. Yeah, I'd have to think about it, but I suspect you're right, but more than suicide. Even I have a very large like file, Excel file of serial killers and various other murderers, and from the over 800 full-length biographies, true crime biographies that I have scattered throughout the apartment. And the suicide rate among the convicted serial killers is quite high. And in contrast, to the men of that generation, and so on. But do you mean like killing their own children or killing
Yes.
other?
Killing
We've been
themselves.
seeing a lot of that
Yeah.
filicide, like most recent here in New York with the death of the young 8-year-old boy Thomas Falva.
Oh yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so we're seeing a lot of that, and it seems that it's like 1 every 30 days. Those are the stats that we're seeing.
Or judges giving the child to the abuser, and then the abuser saying "ha ha" and then killing
Yes.
the child,
Yes.
and then
But
leaving that
in
person
that case,
to suffer.
That's another element in the corruption and inadequacy of the court and,
Sure.
and the judges, who are making incorrect decisions, which then end in tragedy.
Yeah,
And
using
not
the
and not
children's
doing
best
anything to get better at it either.
Yeah. And they
It
say
doesn't
it's the
matter how many
children's-
children die. Just
children's best interest.
yeah, children's best interest to be murdered and abused.
Yeah.
So
Let me
well,
get a shot of the both of you.
okay, and just we're gonna wrap this up because Dr. Stone has a patient that is here and waiting. But we will hopefully do a next part because I think this is something that
Yeah, that's fine.
we have so much to cover.
I'll
So
make sure that there isn't anyone waiting.
yeah, it's we did so much talking before we went live, or we're not even really technically live. But again, thank you so much, Dr. Stone. It's been just an honor and a
Thank you.
blessing to be able to talk to you and to learn so much today. Don't forget to. Is there any way that people could maybe reach out to you or get one of your books if they're interested, or anything we can kind of tell the viewers? I'm sure
Well,
that
if they could, the 2 books that might be of most interest, given the topic that we're focusing on, is The Anatomy of Evil
yeah.
and The New Evil,
Mm-hmm.
both published by Prometheus Press, which is in New York.
Mhm.
But if they Google my name, or they Google, they will easily see the list of books.
Okay.
That it's very easy to purchase.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you again, and thank you for sharing all this interesting information with
My
us.
pleasure.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
So